Good evening to you all. Good evening, Stuart. It is a great pleasure to introduce Stuart Corbridge's lecture this evening. Stuart, of course, the Vice-Chancellor of our university. He's speaking this evening in the lecture series that we share with the IAS on the future of the universities, and his title is there for all to see. British universities have enjoyed a long period of growth and prosperity, but find themselves now increasingly in the face of difficult circumstances. Obviously, Brexit, the question of student fees, the demands of social access. These are just a few of the many pressing questions that will shape the nature and form of universities in the UK in the immediate period ahead. To these familiar issues, we need to add the changing political and social culture of our times, in which liberal values appear more vulnerable than they have done in recent years. The independence of universities, freedom of criticism within universities, the unfettered pursuit of truth and research are all under pressure. Hence, we need to be clear what universities are for so we can better defend them. Stuart has had a wide-ranging career from early days in Cambridge, where we met, to becoming Deputy Director and Provost of the LSE, where he and I also met. But a short trip from Cambridge to London does not define his intellectual journey, because in between, Stuart worked far afield from India to the United States. Stuart is a geographer by training, specialising in geopolitics, development studies in India, and his most recent books focus on India, but he has published widely on development questions. So please join with me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Many of you will know perhaps that I prefer just to sort of ad lib from the front, particularly if we're doing congregations, but I'm actually going to read my talk tonight for about 45 minutes and then take any questions that people have. So let me put my glasses on and then we can get going. So just want to say, first of all, good evening to everybody, and thank you very much for being here tonight. I know that we should have had this lecture back during the snow and the strike at the end of February. And a big thank you in particular to David and to University College for inviting me to take part in a really very distinguished Castle lecture series on the future of the university. I feel especially honoured to be speaking in the same series as Lord Willits, who's, let me see if I can get this thing to work, whose recently published account of a university education has set a new high water mark for serious discussion of universities, in my view, especially in the UK. Indeed, after reading David's book over the winter vacation, I reworked my lecture to engage with him and with our government and political masters more extensively than I had imagined doing in November last year, when I supplied David with the title for my talk tonight. Happily, that title is easily adapted. It's all-encompassing, after all, the uses and misuses of universities. Many of you will know, perhaps, that it's a riff on the title of another outstanding book on modern universities, which is Clark Kerr's account of the uses of the university. And I'll come back to the historiography, if you like, of that book shortly. Kerr's book is probably best known now for several witty epigrams, and perhaps most of all for his parting shot on standing down as Chancellor of the University of California system in the 60s. I say standing down, but as several of you might also know, Kerr, who had led Berkeley through many changes in the early and mid-1960s, and who faced a great deal of hostility from students and faculty members as the Vietnam War ratcheted up, was dismissed from office by the University of California Board of Regents in 1967 for allegedly responding too leniently to student unrest, a charge made against him in the gubernatorial campaign of one Ronald Reagan in 1966. Kerr, though, had the last words at a dedication ceremony for a new building on the UC campus at Santa Barbara in 1967. At that meeting, he reportedly looked each regent in the eye who was present and declared that he had left the presidency of the university just as he had entered it, and I quote, "fired with enthusiasm." He was fired by the regents of the California system. In the third edition of his book, published in 1982, and the book accumulated over many years, original lectures in 63 and then in 72, 82, 94 and 2001, Kerr also reported a witticism that he voiced in the 1950s that has become much more problematic over the years, at least in its first part, when he noted that I once said that the great administrative problems of the day were organising sex for the students, athletics for the alumni, and car parking for the faculty. Notwithstanding that, though, Kerr's account of the uses of the university has maintained its relevance, and that's not just because of its nuanced prose and witty epigrams, but rather more so because its author was one of the first to make two linked observations. First, that in the United States, after the end of the Second World War, a large number of new research-intensive universities were founded or renewed with large infusions of government money, including from the defence budget or the military-industrial complex. And second, that the growth of higher education in the United States after 1945 would not only need to embrace a new kind of research university, going far beyond anything imagined by Humboldt or the Germans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but will also need to make mass tertiary education available through a much broader ecology of higher education institutions, running all the way from community colleges to the private Ivy League universities. So Kerr himself first served as university president at Berkeley, which was for him the flagship multi-university, sitting at the top of the entire California system, to which he would later transfer as chancellor. The president and executive team at the head of a multiversity had to organise, this is Kerr from Time magazine, the president and executive team at the head of a multiversity had to organise not just car parking, but high quality education, high quality research, both externally funded and otherwise, relationships with industry and with government, and increasingly relationships with an alumni community that will be called upon to build huge endowments for America's leading universities, both public and private. Things have become complicated, one might say, and Kerr was one of the first to write about the multiversity as a business, although I don't think he actually used that precise term. Kerr also recognised that as the scale and ambition of scientific research in particular was stepped up, the funding of universities in different parts of the ecosystem would become more politically fraught. Indeed, might bring university leaderships into relationships with various stakeholders that would be characterised by some as Faustian bargains, or perhaps even as invitations to the construction of imperial universities where scholarly dissent is met with administrative repression. Less charged perhaps has been the rephrase that universities simply lose their way as they become multiversities or quasi-businesses. I think this view has been expressed most trenchantly in this country by Stefan Collini, particularly in his book from 2012, What Are Universities For? But it's not an uncommon complaint on both sides of the Atlantic, particularly, I would say, from scholars in the humanities and liberal arts. Now, I addressed the issue of the humanities in a lecture delivered at Hatfield College 19 months ago, and so I don't propose to pick that up again tonight. Suffice to say that Durham is proudly committed to the humanities for a whole host of reasons, mainly to do with scholarship, but also embracing basic economics. I don't for one moment believe that the future of democracy itself depends on university support for humanities, which is a claim that's been made by the great Martha Nussbaum. But I am strongly of the view that universities like Durham must promote intellectual disciplines and viewpoints which are challenging and properly difficult, the humanities very much included. After all, as Ted Gupp wrote recently in the Chronicle of Higher Education, Durham is precisely a, or the university where the humanities need no defence. And I'm hugely grateful to Ted Gupp for that article in the Chronicle of Higher Education. We didn't even pay him. It's wonderful. Now, I'm going to come back to the matter of difficulty later on. For now, though, and in the main part of my talk, I want to run two main themes together, moving on from Kerr and the United States to David Willetts, Joe Johnson, Sam Jima, and the UK. The first theme is what I will call the view from above. One thing that struck me in my university career, particularly my senior career, is how important it is to try and understand how things might look from the next rung up. So, from the view of a head of department, if you're a faculty member, from the point of view of a faculty pro-vice-chancellor, if you're a head of department, and so on. And in my case now as a VC and a member of the executive, how things look at the level of the Russell Group, Universities UK, or the government, and I'd say especially the government. The second theme I will call the view from below, and this means trying to remind myself how things might look to the average faculty member or member of the professional services. Now, some of you might think this also requires a sense of the absurd from time to time, or a sense that we senior administrators can be too easily seduced by what my ex-colleague David Graeber at the LSE, who some of you might know is associated with the Occupy movement, has called the utopia of rules and the stupidity and secret joys of bureaucracy that can come with it. It might surprise you, but as it happens, I agree, and I will come back to this too. If we don't have trust, we can too easily lapse into over-regulation for its own sake, and a Kafkaesque world begins to beckon. Some of you might know that David's new book, Professor Graeber's new book, which came out 2 weeks ago, is called Bullshit Jobs, a Theory, but that's for another occasion. It's an interesting guy. And so to end a long beginning, what I want to do tonight is speak both as a manager and more personally, drawing on my sense of the key issues now being discussed in the UK and on my own experiences working in academia in the UK and the US over nearly 40 years. Right, so section 2, from Kerr to Willetts. One obvious link from Kerr to Willetts is that both men begin their books with some reflections on the origins and development of modern universities, with both authors paying homage to Newman and Humboldt, especially Humboldt, along the way. What's interesting about Lord Willetts's account, however, is that his prologue serves a second purpose. In addition to providing some important chronological background for his account of a university education, Willetts uses history to establish an important general theme for his book and for his time as UK Minister for Universities and Sciences. And that is the distorting effect on UK higher education of Oxbridge. Specifically, you might know this if you attended David's lecture, Willetts sets out to argue not simply that Oxbridge blocked the development of a broader regional ecology of higher education provision in England before the 1830s, which it did, but also that the subsequent development of higher education in the UK up to the times of the Robbins expansion in the 60s and beyond was closely based on the Oxbridge model of national residential universities and a nationwide entry system to those universities through UCA in my day and now UCAS. This system was tempered in part by the growth of polytechnics, and I started my career happily at a polytechnic, at least up to the point that they became universities with degree awarding powers in 1992. But Willetts maintains that overall the UK has shunned the system of regional universities that has developed across North America and Europe in favour of what he calls the boarding school model of university development, which Oxbridge embodies. Now, that's an important observation, and Willetts adds to it two further observations about the distinctiveness of universities in the UK. The first of these concerns the power of disciplines in the UK and their backward linkages to university admissions. UK universities, Willits maintains, have been powerful advocates of a post-16 education system that supplies them with well-trained historians or mathematicians, but at the expense of intellectual roundedness or the ability of applicants to keep options open while their minds are still expanding. And he contrasts the UK system unfavourably with the baccalaureate or abitur systems common in Europe, also with an admissions system in the US in which many entrants don't declare or need to declare a major until their second or sophomore year. Now, I think it's possible that Lord Willits overdoes the role of British universities in perpetuating an early choice system. A lot of schools in the UK, as we know, do choose the baccalaureate route, and all UK universities, so far as I know, are pleased to accept students from that background. Willits might also underestimate the benefits to students, what he's going to call consumers, I'm going to come to this, and not just staff, producers of early specialisation. There is joy in difficulty and being pushed, and I know this myself, not a little pain in teaching and attending 100 level classes that can sometimes feel remedial or patronising in tone, at least when they're badly judged. But still, the point made by David Willits clearly has merit. The second observation that Lord Willits develops is more radical in tone and is to be found in his chapter on getting into university. And this concerns the social conservatism of the English, more so than the British, I would say, system of university admissions, a point which David accepts as linked to the role of university league tables in guiding university decision making. Now, in a key paragraph, and I'm just going to show part of it, Lord Willits speaks back to those who opposed his support for a university entrance system less geared to final A-level results and personal or sometimes parental statements and more attuned to background and potential. Now I'm going to read out the full paragraph from Willits, of which the next bit is only part. So I'll come to this, but it's part of it. The full paragraph goes as follows. As I listened to opponents arguing that we were ignoring merit in the interests of fighting a class war, I had in front of me evidence of the sort which an IFS researcher crisply summarised as follows. When comparing pupils with the same background characteristics and prior attainment, studying at the same universities in the same subjects, those from selective independent schools are 2.6 percentage points more likely to drop out, 6.4 percentage points more likely to complete their, less likely to complete their degrees, and 10.3 percentage points less likely to graduate with a first or 2-1 than pupils from non-selective community schools. That's the quote from the IFS person in his head. And Willits continues, so who were the real meritocrats? And he concludes, one decision rule is for a university to recruit so as to equalise the students from different backgrounds getting a good degree, say a first or a 2-1. If you could show that students from tougher backgrounds outperform at university, then you could allow them in with lower A-level grades. Now, it happens that we've got great expertise on this at Durham, and we're starting to do this at the university. But what's then interesting is what follows this declaration, because Lord Willits' account of admissions in the UK is bookended by some observations on admissions in the US, where more explicit attempts are made to, quote, mould the class to ensure that not all future leaders graduating from Harvard or Princeton or California or Indiana are white and middle class. And I quote again, the trickiest question, Willits concludes, and rarely spoken, is whether there could be more to university admission than academic merit. And he kind of leaves it hanging there in the air. In the end, I think David Willits chooses to side against the US system of trading some admissions for endowments. And certainly he recognises that any VC who too boldly drops admissions grades would likely see their university slide down league tables. Our incentive systems are geared strongly to league table positions and competition. This brings me to the heart of my talk. University league tables are constructed by the press and other agents, not by the government. But their production and power are consistent with an approach to higher education that runs through the recent Higher Education Research Act, with its twin emphases on market competition and the well-informed student consumer. David Willetts recognises this and acknowledges that every metric, every KPI, and every league table changes behaviour. It's bound to. But I will argue later that he underestimates the tensions that can arise between standardising data sets and the drive for difference that he's generally so keen to stimulate. Let me just take a little bit more on Willetts before coming to my own views. More broadly, the charge sometimes brought against Lord Willetts and the recent Act is that both have fostered the Americanisation of UK higher education, which is the thread I'm following here. Willetts says that's not the case, and I think he's largely right. He maintains that the US is simply further advanced than the UK in embracing student choice through admissions, through credit transfers, through the creation of a broad ecology of higher education. And in recognising that in answering Collini's question, what are universities for, there cannot and should not be only one answer. Things moved on with the Robbins expansion, and they moved on again under Tony Blair and then the coalition. The Higher Education and Research Act then is responding to new realities, not just blindly importing an American model into higher education in England and Wales. I believe that Willetts is right to welcome these expansions and right to insist that a university education, the title of his book, benefits not just its consumers, but also their parents. They live longer in part as a result of their interactions with their alert and well-informed children and grandchildren. You can demonstrate this empirically, and entire cities and countries. Alongside his chapter on admissions, Lord Willetts' chapter on why it's worth going to university does a superb job in making a series of arguments that really can't be made often enough, and which really shouldn't need to be made to the Treasury, in my view, as often as they are. One would hope by now that government would recognise the enormous economic contributions and social contributions made by UK universities and by our international students. This is a slide from Willetts' book. Finally, in terms of the Americanisation charge, it's worth noting that Lord Willetts in office proposed a scheme of university financing, a graduate contribution scheme, that's very different to the upfront charging system common in the United States. We can argue about the merits of the system that Willetts and the coalition introduced in 2012. David and I well remember some of the events in London at that time. But its chief architect is right to maintain that this scheme is bespoke to the UK, it's innovative, and that contrary to the expectation of many of its critics, it hasn't slowed the growth of university entrants from low-income backgrounds. Indeed, if anything, the reverse is true. Now, we know that the financing of UK universities is set to become an issue again in 2019, and we all share an interest in seeing how the government reacts to the current post-18 education and funding review. And that will happen at the end of the year, early next year. I'm going to let that pass tonight. Lord Willetts also takes time in a university education to commend the Higher Education and Research Act that was passed by Parliament in June 2017. He admits that some of the language of the Act and the preceding paper, which was called Success in a Knowledge Economy, is utilitarian, which is, I think, generous. But of course, he supported Joe Johnson's ambition to create new higher education providers. That goes back to Willetts' view of UK higher education being dominated by producer interests. and to allow for some exit from the system, or mergers perhaps, given issues around students being left in the lurch by closures and given concerns about the socialisation of pensions debt through the USS. And naturally, Lord Willett supports the central thrust of the Act, which is to enfranchise students as consumers. This is at one with his view that academics in Russell Group universities are too strongly incentivised to produce referable outputs to the exclusion of good or innovative teaching or links to industry, a proposition that I will challenge, and with his commitment to transferring much of the burden of paying for mass higher education from taxpayers to consumers, otherwise known as students. Willits wants students to have greater choice of courses and universities, as do I, and to have more and better information about the benefits that flow from their investment choices. Again, as do I, but up to a point. I think Lord Willits also wants employers and students to have more information about their achievements, fine, and believes this will lead us soon enough to a GPA system of assessment and recording. And again, I think that probably will happen. So where do I depart from Lord Willits? I regret much of the tone of the HERA Higher Education Research Act debate and an early reluctance by some of its proponents to say anything of substance about intellectual challenge or difficulty. But I'm certainly in favour of a wider ecology of higher education in the UK, and I welcome attempts to valorise different forms of higher education within an expanding system. Like most VCs too, I have no problem with private entrance to the HE marketplace or new forms of medical provision within existing universities like Aston, although I'm naturally minded to argue that assurance regimes should be less intrusive for established providers. And for the record too on REF, since it might come up in questions, I share Lord Willits's view that its administrative costs are actually relatively low compared to those associated with Research Council funding, and that it's not unreasonable to use QR funding to incentivise new forms or supposedly new forms of academic behaviour, as with the impact to gender in REF 2014. Whether we need a REF or not in the UK is another matter, and perhaps we can pick that up in questions. To my mind, good universities use their own recruitment and progression systems to ensure the consistent production of world-leading research with or without a REF. I also note that Lord Willits has doubts about the wisdom of separating university regulation between the Office of Students on the one hand, teaching, and Research Council's UK research on the other, and I share that concern. We have to see how that plays out. But there are areas where I depart from Lord Willits, so I want to move on to those and conclude. Including, I think, on the future funding of UK universities, where I think there are more options to explore. The two main areas where I would push Lord Willits and Sam Gema, Joe Johnson when I drafted this lecture talk, are around information and incentives. So let me move to a conclusion by taking them in turn, but noting they're interlinked. At the heart of the Higher Education and Research Act is the notion of a well-informed consumer buying products and services in an increasingly competitive higher education marketplace. The fundamental role then of the Office for Students, the new regulator, along with the Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA, and the Information Commissioner, is to help the buyer beware. Caveat emptor is to be enabled by resolute actions to disrupt so-called cartel-like behaviour, for example in the setting of degree prices or fees, and by challenging untruths in advertising. Most of all, the government wants to empower prospective and current students to make wise and well-informed choices about expensive and far-reaching career decisions. Now, all that sounds fine in principle, or largely I suspect, but I take issue with the idea that crucially important information sets are currently unavailable to students, which is a key argument for the Teaching Excellence Framework, and with the idea that the consumer can always be sovereign in the higher education space. I can deal with the latter point very quickly. Students might soon be enabled to complain to the OFS if they're not receiving X number of contact hours and such complaints might well be empowering for the complainant and a useful bromide for the supplier or producer. But there have to be limits to consumer sovereignty around the difficulty of the curriculum or academic judgment on the merits of essays and exam scripts. Buying a car and buying a degree have similarities, but they're clearly not the same. On information sets, I'm going to develop my argument slightly greater length and with reference to the TEF, the Teaching Excellence Framework. Now, this is my private argument, so I should say at once that Durham University is committed to the TEF, this is on tape, and that I fully expect us to do well in TEF 3 and beyond. And I know that amongst Russell Group Vice-Chancellors, there's a minority of us that feel more strongly about the TEF than others. I recognise too that the TEF is in its infancy and that efforts will be made in due course to measure teaching and learning outcomes more directly. The focus at the moment being very much on inputs and imperfect proxy variables. But I have concerns about the assumption that student consumers need to see gold, silver or bronze stars alongside existing data on course fees, degree results, NSS results, figures from the government's longitudinal education outcomes database, LEO, and the assurances provided by the UK system of external examination and its extensive quality assurance regimes. There surely needs to be a balance between information supply and the costs of supplying that information, and I don't think we have that balance right. I also wonder what we will make of our starting assumptions about information supply and consumer sovereignty if, as I expect and is happening, students continue to apply in large numbers to some well-known universities, David and I can think of one, in receipt of a bronze TEF award. Are those students badly informed and acting perversely? Can the sovereign consumer be wrong? Or are these students making a reasonable judgment about the value of the degrees they are applying for and the value of the TEF gold, silver and bronze system? Well, we'll have to see. The Minister will most likely maintain that TEF will force universities to pay more attention to teaching and learning. Perhaps that will be the case. What I'm less willing to accept is the prior intuition that universities were not generally concerned to improve teaching and learning outcomes before the advent of the TEF. I really don't think that was the case for most universities. And I don't think it's what most major annual surveys like NSS have been telling us. Most university administrations have some basic idea of who might be letting the side down when it comes to teaching. It's a very small number of people, I suspect, at Durham. Or about student concerns around assessment and feedback. And most universities are already taking actions to address those concerns and the feedback from quality assurance visits and annual NSS results. But as David said, I've also worked in the States. And I note that American universities apparently flourish without the onerous regimes of quality assurance and information supply that we're busy building in the UK. Whenever I've taught in the States, I've rather quickly designed my course, quickly in the sense that few approvals were needed, which I quite liked, taught it and then examined it. There are no external examiners and no QAA, and yet the students that I thought would come near the top did, and those near the bottom also generally did, much as in the UK. But at the heart of that system was an honour code and a large amount of trust by the institution in the individual faculty member and by the student in her or his instructor. Now that system's not perfect. Cheating happens in the US just as it happens in the UK. There's been grade inflation in many institutions, which might be linked in part to grading pressures on instructors. And the disposition to sign off new courses quickly doubtless reflects the nature of a credit building system rather than one focused more squarely on curriculum development. But in my view, overall, the system works. Students hand in evaluations of their courses, just as in the UK, and employers judge their transcripts, much as they do in the UK. The assurance costs, though, of the two systems are very different, and I worry that subject-level TEF will remove the UK even further from the low-cost, high-trust systems enjoyed by many of our global peers. Most of all, I worry about the incentivisation effects of some of our insurance regimes and metrics. Many of these effects will be unintended, but we should be wary about any metrics that push us to forms of teaching and learning that become too standardised and too cautious, or where the drive is always to the middle and the safe. David Willetts rightly cites an important, if controversial, study of so-called limited learning on campuses by Richard Aram and Josipa Roxa. Indeed, he pays close attention to what he calls perverse incentives in an American system where, and I quote from Willetts, quote, "The culture of giving the students just what they want is far worse than here being the UK, and reinforced by explicit use of student reporting on their professors. These perverse incentives arguably lead to a situation where, as described by Aram and Roxa, students, and I quote again, do not appear to show much cognitive gain after 3 years of study at university if you set them a sophisticated comprehension test or some maths challenges." What's slightly curious, though, about Lord Willetts' account of this American problem is that he doesn't then examine why, and I quote, "this is a growing issue across the OECD countries, including England," as he maintains it is. He doesn't ask whether some of the assurance systems that our government has been building up in the UK might be linked in clear and direct ways to this unhappy outcome, to giving students what they think they want, or more explicit use of student reporting on their professors. In my view, there is a case to answer, and we should be worried about the introduction of further inspection and incentive regimes that might encourage faculty members, perhaps slowly, quietly and unwittingly, to remove elements of intellectual challenge and difficulty from their courses. I wouldn't want that to happen at Durham, and I wouldn't want it to happen for UK PLC. I'm proud of the fact that the vast majority of Durham's courses are intellectually demanding and very well taught, and I want this to continue as it will, TEF or no TEF. There's a parenthesis here that I won't go into. Now, I should say, moving to a conclusion at this point, that I do accept David Willetts' argument made towards the end of his book that universities do still have degrees of freedom in the ways they operate, notwithstanding all these national regimes. Some of the problems that we think government creates for us might be problems of our own making, just as some problems that academics might think are made for them by the executive, the Kremlin, are in fact local rules that can be undone. And we do have a habit of piling assurance regimes on ourselves. So let me conclude on a positive note while making one further observation about Willetts' account of university education, namely that it has surprisingly little to say about the wider student experience and co-curricular activities. I must say I found that rather odd. After all, it's not just collegiates or even Russell Group universities that heavily invested in activities like drama, music, sport and volunteering. Increasingly, all universities need to engage their student, and I would say staff bodies, around issues of well-being, leadership and personal development. What Anthony Selden and Alan Martin have called the issues defining the positive university. And this brings me back once again to league tables and incentives. As things stand, universities like Durham are not well incentivised to work in this space, which I think is really unfortunate. And yet all of the activities that I've just mentioned are crucial to a whole host of agendas that the government shows interest in: well-being, mental health and value for money. So maybe this could be moved higher up the government's agenda than the proposed knowledge exchange framework, or KEF, which on the face of it might be treading on the toes of REF and adding little extra value. We shall see, but we can also act, and we are acting. I'm pleased to say that Durham University is working in partnership with the Arts Council on a new commission on creativity in education that will report next year, 2019. The research that we're carrying out in support of the Commission will very quickly inform the education that students will receive here at Durham. In addition, and linked in, we will be rolling out an entirely new version of the Durham Award in academic year 2019-20 that we hope will be taken by maybe 75%, if we're lucky, of our students. This will sit outside the curriculum and will demonstrate Durham's commitment to rewarding our students for their volunteering or other collective goods activities. It will also help students with career-enhancing skills, provide more courses for audit, and crucially, ensure that Durham students are properly equipped to lead what we might call an examined life. In this last regard, we propose to roll out as part of the Durham Award 2 new courses, one on global citizenship and one that has the title that Alan Houston gave it, which is from Monty Python, called The Argument Clinic. Both courses will make use of pre-recorded videos, TED-style talks and animations, be ample opportunity for discussion in flipped classrooms, and will feature new assessment and quizzing technologies. I won't say too much more tonight about content, save to say that the main purpose of the Argument Clinic, and I mention this with reference to Donald Trump, is not to teach a set of isms or to commend one view of the world. It is rather, and I think quite importantly, as you can see from this early working draft syllabus, a course designed to steer students clear of simply bad arguments and poor reasoning, which seems actually quite important right now. And it will be challenging. It will be difficult in the best sense of that word. Creative too, I trust, and it will be developed, particularly with the Global Citizenship course, with the student body. It can be doubly flipped with the students actually leading courses for staff members. All the things that I think our students will need more of as we approach what some scientists are calling the technological singularity, or what might more plainly be called the fourth industrial revolution. Lastly, a second announcement, again linked to incentives. About 18 months ago, the government was considering an initiative that would have required universities to run schools to a high standard on pain of seeing their, in other words, our fee income reduced. I remember this came into the university on a Friday afternoon, and it wasn't April the 1st. There was a lot of discussion of that proposal, and most VCs that I know are actually really keen to help the government with its social mobility agenda. There was scepticism, however, about some aspects of this new initiative, about the intuition, for example, that universities know how to run schools. Some do, many of us don't. About the suggestion that running schools should be made compulsory. About the link to Ofsted ratings, which would simply have encouraged Durham, I suspect, to open a new school in leafy West Durham for the sons and daughters of faculty, rather than a school that might be more valuable in a more deprived part of County Durham. And about the proposed link between an Ofsted rating and a university's ability to set a tuition fee above £6,000. Now, happily, in this case, from discussion came progress, which I think is what we all want. The government is now concentrating instead on improving maths tuition in a small number of sixth form centres linked to universities. So the model's been pioneered by Exeter and by King's College London. And I'm pleased to say that Durham University is now in talks with the Department of Education about a centre that we might run either here in Durham City or somewhere else possibly in the county or region. In this case, the incentive regime looks as if it will work for both of us, to support what the government wants and what works best for Durham and our local communities, with a strong emphasis on access and widening participation. I very much hope so. This, I think, is where we need to be with the government. We need to be in constructive, serious dialogue about activities that add value. And I'm suspicious of the idea that TEF really adds value. The coalition and its government and its successors have brought in a wide raft of higher education reforms, some of which were long overdue in my view, and many of which I do support. Now David Willits has written a magnificent book that walks us through the economic and political context of those reforms. I believe that David's book, A University Education, will be widely seen as the best book yet written on universities. I hope and believe too that David's book and the new higher education landscape in the UK, which he's done so much to create, invite reflection and constructive engagement, and that's what I've tried to offer tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stuart. A lot of ground covered, and I'm sure an audience ready to cross-examine you. Prosecutors, raise your hands. Yes, let's 2 or 3 questions at a time, or one at a time?
Let's see how they go, shall we?
All right, let's start.
Say who
you are then.
Hello, my name is Harry Koss, I'm a PhD student. Thank you for your talk. You mentioned the disciplinary effects of league tables, for example, affecting access, where we're the worst in the country. And I think in league tables we should also look at rankings and metrics, which are from the government, such as TEF, REF and NSS, which you've criticised. So my question is, what is the university doing about this? Because the student movements are there saying, boycott NSS, don't opt into TEF when it's still optional. And just it would take just a few Russell Group universities to change that balance of power, and the student movement is there, and it's from the university executives that the support is lacking.
Enough questions.
Thanks, Harry. Well, if we take access first, I mean, that's more in our control than some other things. So you will certainly see at the university this year a much higher percentage, we trust in August, of students from state school backgrounds coming to Durham than would have been the case a couple of years ago. We all know that there are state schools and state schools. We have seen an increase recently in the percentage of people from LPN backgrounds, low participation neighbourhoods, and from Acorn 4-5. And you will see that continue with the new access policies that Alan Houston is responsible for. I did not speak against NSS. I'm actually a believer still in NSS, although I know it's under pressure, or in REF. What I said about REF is that in my view it's reaching the end of its life, in the sense that good universities are putting in place promotion and progression systems that will guarantee high quality research. But I mean, it's for the government to decide how it allocates QR, which is quality related research funding. On the TEF, there are different views on this, as you know. I'm not a fan of TEF, and that's why I've chosen to speak about it tonight. I'm particularly not a fan of subject level TEF. I don't really see how it's going to add great value. I do worry that it is going to take a lot of time in universities and will push us towards a middle course. So, you know, I'm doing my bit by speaking out about that tonight. I can see the government's arguments for having some kind of a teaching excellence framework, but as we know at the moment it doesn't really measure teaching outcomes at all. So I'm trying to contribute to that debate as best I can by going public about my own concerns about subject level TEF.
Do you want to come back on that or move on?
Well, just for example, when Durham University got the silver ranking, that would have been an option to say this is a flawed metric that we're trying to challenge, and instead the university's response was, we got silver, we think we deserve gold. Yes,
and there's a sense in which I think we definitely did think that we probably deserved gold, and we have put back in again. We took it to Senate, we took it to Council, whether we should re-enter this competition. And now it's been, you know, you have to take part in TEF now as a condition of registration for the Office of Students. That's the way that things work. But in my capacity privately tonight as VC, I'm speaking out against subject level TEF. It's not something that I believe in. I think it's going to happen. But I've given a couple of reasons for why I don't think it's particularly necessary. First of all, I don't think that universities are not addressing issues of teaching quality. I think there are plenty of incentives for us to take teaching quality seriously. And I'm not yet convinced that students lack information that they need for making coherent decisions about university choices. So, I mean, I was referring fairly elliptically to the LSE, which I think most people know got a bronze star, but I believe that in the last year applications to the LSE have increased. Now, either consumers are not sovereign or consumers are sovereign and they're choosing to discount that information set against the others. But there are times where you can speak out in a more personal capacity, I think, Harry, and at other times you are representing the university. So I was trying to make it clear tonight, in this particular forum where I have a chance to speak more personally. That's my particular view on subject level TEF.
Hi George, following years I'm Milner and income president of the SU. I want to press you kind of a bit further on the issue of access. Because I'm not, having looked at the stats, I'm not sure I share your incredibly optimistic view of Durham's progress on that. And also, in recent years, Durham cut the Durham grant that kind of helped support financially so the lowest students from lowest income backgrounds, and more recently cut support progression. So I want to think about exactly what you are doing on that. Also, in acknowledgement of the fact that it's not just about these students getting into universities like Durham, but it's also about the support they have when they're here.
Yeah.
And how, especially in the light of sort of incredibly high cost of living and student experience in Durham, how you expect those students, those backgrounds to be able to come and thrive, given the cuts we've seen to the Durham grant.
Yeah, I mean, those are perfectly fair points, of course, George. I mean, I think in terms of the statistics, I mean, we can sort of work it through with Alan Houston or somebody that's really on top of all the statistics, but I think they will show that over a 2 or 3 year period, particularly when you look at what's likely to happen this year, we are seeing real progress against the 2 government metrics, which would be LPN and Acorn 4-5, and state schools, which is not an official metric, but something that, the community as a whole, my sense of judging what happens at Senate, seems to matter to people. So I think that there is evidence that we're making some progress there. I absolutely agree with you, and I mean, it's been a discussion, as you know, with the person that you're taking over from, Megan, and the current student leadership, around how it is that we facilitate students to enjoy all that Durham has to offer whilst they're here. And for that, we're constantly looking at the bursary provision, building up scholarship provision. I think the campaign for Durham will help us there. We simply don't have that sort of endowment base that has been reported yesterday, for example, in the press in respect of Oxford and Cambridge. And that's going to be a major project for us to try and get that resource in so that we can work on that same agenda that you're concerned about. Do you want to come back?
I mean, I feel like I'm not convinced by simply saying it's because we don't have enough of the down. I feel like there are funding choices that have been made, and I think that if we are serious about widening access, I think there is more the university could be doing.
Well, yeah, okay. I mean, we do have discussions around this, and I'm sure that you're right. Of course, in the general sense, we can do more. It is where the trade-offs are. I think there are some specific issues that we need to address as well. So, in terms of access of particular community groups, ethnic groups to Durham, there's a lot more that we could be doing, but we have to recognise where we are geographically. So we've had conversations when OFFA existed, OFFA, the Office for Fair Access, existed, about what our particular responsibilities might be, and it might be more around white working class boys in this particular part of the country than if you're sitting down, in the London area. So I think there are discussions that we can have there. There's far more that we can do with local schools. So we're trying to do that in Durham City, we're trying to do it in Stockton, we've been trying to do it in Seaham and other areas. Whether we should be engaged with some other cities, like going down to Haringey, which is something that we did look at, is something that we can have a further conversation about at some point. I mean, I think most of us are on the same page here. We would like to see a much more diverse Durham and well-supported students here. So I think it's more about working about how we do that. And it's your job to sort of put in and pressurise around that next year, George.
I'm sure he'll manage.
Yeah.
Rob.
So I'm interested in what you're talking about latterly and the argument clinic, and delighted to see this kind of broader take on the educational experience here at Durham. And it seems, this is a very kind of interdisciplinary kind of perspective on that kind of on the student experience, and in fact exactly the kind of thing that a number of us have been proposing for quite a long time and suggesting in terms of co-curriculum, in terms of contextualising the educational experience and giving students the broader picture and encouraging them to explore that. But I'm slightly puzzled as to why it's been so hard over the years, and we've been suggesting this kind of thing for a couple of years, to develop these ideas from the bottom up at Durham. And now we have something that's coming which seems to be kind of a bit more top down. So why is it that it's so hard at Durham to develop these innovative, exciting ideas from the bottom up and get the executive to take them on board and run with them?
Okay, I mean that's a really. I just realised that you're here, Megan. Perhaps bring Charlie in on this one, because I can see Charlie sitting in front of Megan. Now, the idea for the Durham Award did partly come top down. In fact, I first spoke about it 19 months ago at Hatfield. Partly because I've been involved with a core course before at my previous institution called LSE 100. And it seemed to me that it would be really interesting at Durham to do something which would credit the students for some of the things that they're doing anyway. So whether it's particularly volunteering, which we're keen to incentivise, but give them credits for music, drama, sport, have some courses available for audit. So I'd be perfectly happy to spend a weekend doing a sort of a class on development that people could perhaps put in a sort of a portfolio, and we knew that a number of colleagues around the university were prepared to do that. And then we thought, well, maybe a couple of core courses. So we did come up with the idea of basically a core course on how not to think badly, which Alan Houston then said, well, let's call it the Argument Clinic. So it starts with the Monty Python video on the Argument Clinic. Actually, what's happened, really interestingly, is once the executive let go of it, it's now really with Owen and Alan. It is being built up, I think, Charlie, much more from the bottom up. It seems to be, I'm getting a tutorial on it myself, I think, in a week's time. So it's one that's actually moved out of the executive to the student body as much, I think, as... I'm going to bring you in, Charlie, because you're smiling, so I don't know whether this is exactly right. But I do feel this is something where Owen and Alan have tried to be involving you in the production of the Durham Award, because the Durham Award will only work since it's outside the curriculum voluntary, if the students buy into it. What we'd like is, when we have congregation in 3 years' time, maybe an asterisk against the student's name if they've taken the Durham Award, and if they don't, the parents sort of nudging, saying, well, why didn't you take it? That would be the incentive mechanism. Is that broadly right, Charlie, that you're involved in it?
Yeah, I would say, so I've been on the project group this year, and we've also had a JCR president involved, and we've both been happy with our sort of level of involvement, but we're also conscious that something that's voluntary will only work if it appeals to students, and so it will be up to us to develop something that will get that take-up. I think the other thing that's worth saying is that there will be the options for departmental courses, perhaps interdisciplinary stuff that is built from the bottom up and is brought to the award by particular faculty members.
So, use the resources you've got here, use the enthusiasm that you've got here. The Institute of Advanced Study, for example, this is exactly the kind of thing we've been suggesting for a couple of years with little response. And so, it's great to see that these ideas are being developed in parallel, but why do it in parallel? Come and take advantage of our enthusiasm and our expertise, and we'll help you to develop this kind of thing.
But there's a broader point here, I think, which is I think underneath your point is a broader point, which is, you spoke earlier. I'm very well aware lots of people want to ask questions, so I'm just only intervening now because I want to broaden the point that Rob made. You spoke very eloquently, Stuart, about the importance of trust.
Yep.
How academics, there's a kind of academic flourishing in kind of decentralized, lightly regulated academic environments where the key producers and academics have a high degree of autonomy to develop and so on. As long as the broad systems of accountability are in place, that's a very positive thing. In the UK at the moment, it seems that potential is undercut by increasing national regulatory regimes on the one side and increasingly centralized universities on the other, which the scope and room for a maneuver from below, I think that's what the bigger point Rob is making, is highly, highly restricted, which thus impacts on invention, innovation, creativity, and so on. All the things you want to encourage.
Yeah.
So I think there's a dual thing going on here. I think that's the bigger point, the more abstract point that Rob is making. And I think that is a legitimate question for you,
absolutely.
as Vice-Chancellor of Durham University.
Yeah, absolutely it is. So, just finish off on the specific question. So there's plenty of opportunity to get involved. One of the things that's going to happen in this course is that a large number of faculty members are going to be putting on almost their pet thing for audit. I've heard about a number of ones that I'll go along to. listen to and take part in. So there's plenty of opportunities, and I'll put you in contact with Owen and Alan. And I'm only sorry that it hasn't happened already, Rob, because I can see I can see the synergies. On the broader point, David, yeah, and I mean, you know, there are definite, there are huge centralising pressures within the UK system. I think David recognises that, even though he's a fan of trying to devolve. And, you know, of course one feels it as a university administrator, bureaucrat, whatever you want to call people sitting in the executive. But if you look, say, at what we've been trying to do on the faculty side, what I would say is that the approach we've taken to hiring then is the university's got a legitimate interest, it seems to me, in saying, in something like computer science, we've got a heck of a lot of people in algorithms, very good, but we want to build applied computer science. And so the university can give that steer, or we want to do more social psychology. After that, we go out and recruit people, and there are mechanisms of accountability through the provost. But we've been very clear at Durham, we're not interested in telling academics what to teach or what to research. That is the essence, to me, of academic freedom. And I think we're far less controlling than most Russell Group universities in that respect. Then if you look at the planning regime, what we've been trying to say is that those departments that have got great REF scores and NSS scores, or TEF if we have to be in that domain, should really have a very light touch regime. And we genuinely do want to back off. But I don't doubt that it's seen very much in different ways, David, and I know that you particularly feel that in the colleges. So it is something that we continue to have to talk through.
But let's move away from that, because I think we could have a long discussion about that.
Yeah, we did mention the Durham Award. I kind of want to bring a slightly different side of it, though. I think one of the problems with seeing students as consumers is that we don't just sort of consume. We actually produce quite a lot as well. We're actually very creative as well. And I think partly we co-sustain or self-sustain ourselves in a lot of things we do. And I think you mentioned that the TEF and the fact that you don't necessarily think it adds a lot of value and things like that. And I just wondered what you thought about that in the context of the Durham Award, because I think part of the issue with students is the idea that rather than sort of providing the real structures that allow us to do better in the things we do, that the Durham Award might essentially do a lot of the standardising without really necessarily adding social level.
Yeah, okay, well, I mean, I hope it doesn't, because the idea is the Durham Award is entirely voluntary, it's outside the curriculum. There'll be credits for things that students ordinarily do, which we'd like to incentivise more, like volunteering. What we're calling the two core courses, and this has moved on, by the way, are around global citizenship and the argument clinic. And my understanding, and I'm genuinely saying that I'm going for my tutorial in a week's time, I think it's June the 7th, on where we are with the Durham Award, is that there's going to be, it's going to be much more like 1,000 flowers blooming in terms of what's being made available, including things that are offered up by students. So my understanding of the way that they're thinking about the global citizenship course is that we'll draw on some of the things that are already happening in, for example, Ustinov, and that we can doubly flip the session. So, I mean, a flip session is fundamentally where people get the information up front, say from a TED talk, and then you have discussion around it, but it's still led by a recognised faculty member. But we could have doubly flipped, where it's a student actually from the front, and some of us are sitting in the audience as part of the discussion. So one of the things that I think we're hoping to do with the Durham Award is to really press the boundaries in terms of being creative and experimental. And if it works there, then we could think about bringing it into the core curriculum. If it doesn't work, it's not the end of the world. So I think there's very much an attempt to get students involved in some of the teaching activities.
I'm Chris Stone, Director of Research in Physics. I'd like to ask about league tables. One of the things I see, not just in REF, is just that the way league tables in many ways mean that other universities are the competition, and we spend a lot of time looking for a very small edge that will just nudge us into second place, or when together we could actually band together and work to pressure government and to lobby government for the sort of university system that we think we should be building.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's I think it's a very interesting question. I mean, first of all, it's very difficult to disinvent these league tables. I mean, these are private sector interests behind the production of these league tables, and they have tremendous power, particularly, as we all know, in certain parts of the world, as much with parents as with prospective students. So there's a sense in which there is a landscape. So one of the things that you can do is try and talk to the people at the top of these league tables and see if you can change some of the metrics. I remember doing that actually at LSE because speaking to Phil Beattie at the Times Higher Ed, must have been around 2011-12, and saying, hold on a minute, you're not normalising citations. You know, we don't have physics at LSE. And they did change that, and that's when you saw the big increase in some of these league tables of places that weren't so much based in heavy science. So there's a moment there. I think more generally, what worries me about the approach that we've been adopting in the UK is the standardisation moment through these different assurance regimes. And I have wondered to what extent you might be able to have a system where the government's going to clearly want accountability because they're still paying, you know, about a lot of our money by the time they've subsidised the student loan scheme. And there would be high transaction costs, but whether or not you could have a system where you strike a deal with government for 5 or 10 years and say, this is the university we would like to be. This is where we see Durham, and these are the metrics against which you could hold us to account. That's very different from where we're drifting towards these league tables that put us all, I think, as you rightly say, on one sort of ladder, where we inevitably have to compete with one another. So I'm strongly in favour of accountability, particularly with other people's money. But the metrics, they have some pretty damaging effects.
And when we accept government money, then yes, we are accountable. But it is not a good use of that money if a lot of senior staff spend a lot of their time trying to work out how to edge 1 percentage point above another university.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, they have refined some of these things quite a lot. So if you take REF, the early iterations of REF, as we know, were all about volume, and then suddenly they moved to 4 outputs, and it was a lot cleaner system. They've got a perfect right, it seems to me, to try and incentivise impact with government money. That's something that they could choose to do. So I think some of these things are more effective than others. But we are very much caught up within this system of metrics in a way that wouldn't have been the case clearly 20 years ago.
Can I get a sense of how many other people want to ask a question? You raise your hands. So that's 3, 4. Should we just take a cluster now?
Yeah, sure.
Just round up.
Yeah.
So let's going from the back to the forward, and then.
Since you mentioned impact just then, that's sort of what my question was about. And you mentioned you also think REF is running to sort of the end of how useful it is. I'm a PhD student in chemistry, just starting my career, and I quite regularly despair, and I use that word quite genuinely, when I see high impact papers which are basically proving nothing aside from proposing a possible application which is never going to work. And you also mentioned about improving incentive schemes within the university. Do you think universities could do slightly more accepting that actually REF even itself is quite broad in what impact means, and that a Nature publication isn't always the most impactful, and sometimes a good database entry, a piece of code, a design, a new idea is often very impactful but is not rewarded in the current system?
Should we get through?
Yeah.
Are you happy to?
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned the viewpoint below at the start of this, and you mentioned faculty, heads of department. You missed out students, talking about what students feel like. So I guess my question is, do you think faculty, heads of department, senior staff think about what students feel like or might think about and know, and are they good at it?
Yeah. Ed Walters, first year music student at University College. Why is Durham consciously moving away from the Oxbridge model? I mean, you experienced it yourself. Did you not like it? Did you think it was supposed to explore? With this increasing centralisation, decreasing college jurisdiction and powers?
I won't comment on that. And finally, Chris.
Hi, Chris Greenwell, Earth Scientist. I'm trying to squeeze 2 in, one more contentious than the other, if I may, Stuart. So, Firstly, when Lord Willits was here, I can't remember whether it was the debate after the evening before or the evening before, he mentioned his one great regret was calling the fees tuition fees instead of university fees.
Yeah, exactly.
As that's going to have some unintended ramifications in terms of accountability, auditing and bureaucracy going forward, it would seem. Secondly, your critique of the US university struck me as rather similar to some of the more lucid and less contentious writings of Toby Young.
This is on tape.
I wondered what your thoughts were on how Toby Young was treated in this era of note forming and freedom of speech.
Gosh, okay.
I think that's enough. You can round up with it.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for all the questions. So, I mean, I was kind of referring to a technical category of impact in the ref, but if we're looking at papers, to me, I do think the ref is reaching a plateau. I think it's done a lot of good actually in the UK in raising the research standards and research outputs over a period of whatever it is now, 25 or 30 years. But like any curve, it becomes asymptotic, doesn't it, after a period. I think you have to ask yourself the question, what is it that you would want to happen regardless of something like ref or TEF? And we would want to incentivise the production of really high quality papers. The judgment on what high quality is will tend to default to different subjects, but you want to be employing academics, junior academics, senior academics, just producing really groundbreaking work as best they can. And I think, generally, if you hire really smart people and set them free to follow their own interests, which I think is what we genuinely do at Durham, we will get good results from that. I'm sorry if I missed out students. I was trying to speak about students most of the time. You're asking me a difficult question because I've not been a head of department here. I've been a head of department elsewhere. My strong sense coming here is that this is an amazingly caring university that really is very student focused. Now, it's for you to and you get a chance, obviously, through NSS and other things to reflect on that. But my strong sense is that the faculty here, I can only compare it with a couple of other Russell Group universities, is very, very strongly committed to the student body, and not just academically, but in terms of the student more broadly. And I think that's what's very special, actually, about Durham. I mentioned Anthony Salden, of course, is the VC of Buckingham University, having been headmaster at Wellington, I think it was, talking about a positive university. But I do think that Durham's interest in well-being and all of those other things is expressive of the fact that this is an area of genuine interest and pride for faculty. That's my sense. There'll be some individual faculty members that will let you down, I'm sure, but that's going to be the case anyway. So that's just my sense, and I'll give you a chance to come back. Oxbridge, I'm not quite sure what to make of the question.
I think it's the same question as I asked you, but in a slightly different form.
That's what I said. I didn't know what to make of the question, David. I think it's interesting to reflect on the differences. I think you're all being invited now to another event that I might go along to quickly. It does come... So Oxbridge, the colleges are clearly integrally involved in the education of students, and for whatever reason that hasn't been embedded at Durham. So we've had a divorce, I think, between what's done in departments and what's done in colleges, and I think that's the fundamental difference between my understanding of Oxbridge, which is mainly Cambridge related, and what's happened at Durham. The second thing that's different about Oxbridge and Durham is that 95% of students at Cambridge and I guess Oxford basically live in college for all 3-4 years, because we've not invested properly in building new colleges over a long period. We're down to 38-39%, and it will take us 10 years even to get to 50%. So I see those as the two defining axes. I don't think there's any intention here to be more centralised, although there's a big difference between Cambridge and Oxford. Oxford's far more decentralised as a university than Cambridge. And then the last question, I think David absolutely regrets calling it tuition fees rather than university fees. We probably have the same issues when we talk about residential fees as opposed to college fees. What you name things really matters because it affects how people think about issues. Toby Young, of course I believe in free speech within the law, but I don't think that some of the things that he said, and I'm sure that he regrets it himself, qualified him to be a prospective member of that body, the OFS.
Well, if you want to ask Stuart further questions, do so afterwards. But before I thank Stuart, this note has already gone around, but I promised I would read it out. The discussion goes on. The future of the university is an important issue, I read, too important to be left to the highest paid executives of our institution. So imagining an alternative university will continue afterwards in the Castle Bar. Those here are invited, in Stuart and I hopefully as well too, as well. So then it just remains for me to thank you, Stuart, for coming. You were always, as the Vice-Chancellor, somewhat coming into the lion's den. You have to stick your neck above the parapet in your position, and we have to challenge you. That's our natural response.
Absolutely.
But I think the quality of the dialogue was excellent, and I hope it continues, because the issues clearly matter greatly. And a lot of people feel strongly about it because they bear and feel the consequences of various kinds of governance structures, put it abstractly, and various kinds of educational management, I think. But these are very poignant and important issues. I'm always struck, though, how the debate in the UK compares often with the US student, but not with the continent or elsewhere, France, Germany, and so on. And if we'd have time, I would have loved to draw you out on some of those comparisons. But it's just for me, of course, on behalf of everybody here, to thank you for coming and to end this year of Castle Lectures. So thank you for referring to it. And for those of you who finished your exams, and congratulations.
Yeah,
those who've got a little way to go home and study, and good luck. And thanks again.
Or join the highest paid executive down the bar. Thanks everybody for coming out.